Hello everyone, welcome. My name is Amy Kurtai and I'm the Acting Director for the Digital Academy Community and Engagement here at the Exchange Lab. Welcome to another edition of the Digital Academy Bytes, coming to you from the Exchange Lab here in beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. I'm privileged to be joining you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen people, also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. The BB8s are an 8-part educational series really seeking to illuminate topics around data, digital, and other emerging methodologies, and we're really excited to be bringing another edition of it to you today. And while we didn't intend it to be this way, it is the 4th day of May, so may the 4th be with you. I'm very pleased to be here with our guest, J-P Fournier. Welcome, J-P. J.P. is the Executive Director of the Digital Investment Office here in the Ministry of Citizen Services. And J.P. will be sharing some of the best practices for developing digital funding requests and just talking about different funding sources and governance processes that one might need to navigate when trying to get some cash. So in terms of formatting for this event, we're going to be using Slido, so really encourage you to put some comments or questions into the chat, and we'll be rolling through them after JP's presentation. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to JP to begin his presentation. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. First question you might be wondering is, what is the Digital Investment Office? So my team at the Digital Investment Office looks after government's IMIT capital envelope and also assesses other big digital funding requests from across government. So we get to see a ton of funding requests, and the team's built up a pretty solid understanding of what a good one looks like. Before I dive into the agenda, I want to talk a little bit about some history I have in this space. So when I first got into the government technology world, some of my bosses I remember thinking were just like Jedi masters when it came to finding money for technology initiatives. Felt like as soon as they had, as soon as someone came up with a new priority or a new initiative that needed to be done, they'd almost make money appear out of thin air. They knew where all the pots of money were. They knew how to get a successful pitch done. And I was just in awe of them. I've spent probably about 8 years or so studying what they do and learning all about this. And today I want to walk you through what I learned from these Jedi Masters, as I call them. So what we'll cover today, and I did go with the Star Wars theme, is 3 levels. One is the Padawan level, where we're going to talk about understanding the broader system of funding sources and that sort of thing. Then move on to the Jedi Knight level, where we talk about building a good pitch. And then we'll dive into the Jedi Master, the Yoda level of how to hack the system. So I'll start with some basics around understanding the system. So the first place I want to start is to talk a little bit about the types of technology funding in government. The first, and the one I'm most familiar with because my team looks after it, is the IMIT capital envelope. So this is capital funding, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, for ministries' tech-related investments. So Treasury Board in BC sets the overall size of this envelope every year. Then we have a Deputy Ministers Committee called the Deputy Ministers Committee on Digital and Data that approves most of these projects. We do a project intake every year starting in May, so we're actually starting, I believe this week, our new intake. So examples of the kinds of things you might have heard of that get funded out of this envelope are things like the initial build of the health gateway or the initial build of the Mines digital service. The next source of technology funding in government is ministry operating budgets. And again, I'll come back to this idea of capital and operating and what that all means. So this is funding for ministry-specific technology solutions and to pay for ministries' portions of shared infrastructure costs. This is approved, like all of our operating expenses in government. It's approved annually by the legislature as part of the Supply Act. A few examples of the kinds of things that fit in here might be mural licenses or application maintenance costs. Next, there's a big bucket of funding for technology that sits within the Ministry of Citizen Services. This is to provide our shared infrastructure services like hosting, storage, those sorts of things. Again, this is approved annually by the legislature as part of the Supply Act. And examples, yeah, it might be hosting or storage or network solutions. There are also a handful of other kind of pots of money hanging around, and those might be federal government funding or even some of our big vendor agreements have credit programs in them. An example you might have heard of is the TELUS Strategic Investment Fund. Okay, I talked a little bit about the capital versus operating, and I want to dive into that a little bit because it's quite important to understand this if you're in the technology space. So capital expenses are costs that provide for a future benefit to government. They're considered, for all you accountants or financial geeks, they're considered investing activities, and so they don't show up on government's statement of operations and instead show up on the balance sheet as a new asset. Capital budgets, because they don't come with that hit to government's operating budget, often are easier for most ministries to get. Examples of where you might use this: building new applications, buying servers, that sort of thing. Operating expenses, on the flip side, are costs incurred as part of day-to-day operations of government. So they show up on government's statement of operations, and so they're really heavily scrutinized. Examples here: application maintenance, cloud hosting, etc. Now these things, this is meant to give you the basics. If you've got detailed questions, your chief financial officer is your best friend, and it's their job to help you navigate these sorts of things. The other last important thing, it's important to understand about digital funding, is this amortization. So amortization is the depreciation of an asset over time. So what happens is when you do a capital project and build something, you incur a capital cost. But over time, and in technology, it's over 5 years, that asset depreciates. And so you need to, government needs to show the decreasing value of that asset on their books. What that means is, for example, if you spent $5 million on a technology system of capital costs, every year after it goes live for 5 years, you're getting hit out of your budget with $1 million amortization charge. So this is really important to know. Okay, enough with, I would call it the boring stuff, but it's actually really important stuff. Let's shift gears into the Jedi Knight level of what it looks like to build a good pitch. So before I dive in, a couple things I want to talk about. One is how the Digital Investment Office evaluates projects. We tend to look at 5 areas. One is strategic alignment. So is this a priority for your ministry, a priority for government? Second is the value proposition. So have you come up with reasonable cost estimates? Are you clear about what government is buying? Is the cost reasonable? Third is delivery approach. So have you got a team structure that makes sense for the problem at hand? Are you using a delivery methodology that's well suited to the problem at hand? This doesn't mean everything is agile, and in fact, I'll dive into this. It means using appropriate methods and tools to get the job done. Fourth is architecture. So are you aligned with government's kind of digital principles and best practices happening in the digital space? Fourth is sustainability. The second thing I want to cover is, in the next slides, I'm going to talk a lot about all of the prep work that needs to come into doing the pitch. If you do that work properly, it takes a ton of effort, but the pitch will almost feel like it writes itself. And so it's sort of the tip of the iceberg. And those Yodas, those Jedi Masters who make it look easy, what you don't see is everything that's below the tip of the iceberg of all of the pre-work of understanding the system and understanding their users and the problems and that it takes to come up with great pitches. So unsurprisingly, item 1 is start with user needs. So we always recommend doing user research to learn about your users and their needs. It's also great to be specific in this area. So don't target everyone. Be really specific about who you're targeting. I'll use an example, a fictional example here, of trying to understand the pain points of British Columbians who use multiple digital public services every month to access services. So in my fictional example, I've estimated there's 80,000 British Columbians who use 2 or more digital services every week. They're frustrated that they have to re-enter the same information about themselves every time they access these services. Second thing to do is clearly define the problem for both users and for government, and this might be the most important thing of all. Again, diving into the fictional example, what this might look like is a statement like this. On average, it takes our frequent flyer users of public services 10 minutes to re-enter their information every time they access a digital service. Their satisfaction scores because of this are 40% lower than the average users of those services who aren't frequent flyers. And these data discrepancies cost government $1 million a year to fix whenever they make a typo or anything like that. Third area to focus on is based on knowing your users and understanding your problem. If you've done a good job of that, you should be able to set really clear outcomes and success measures. And I always say this is something we see left to the end often. Really important to kind of think in outcomes right from day one. So again, back to our fictional example, what this might look like is a statement like this. We plan to save time and increase the satisfaction of our frequent flyer users. We know we'll have achieved this outcome by measuring the time it takes for these users to re-enter the same information about themselves on a new digital service they're using, and by measuring their customer satisfaction scores with those services. So notice we've spent a lot of time with users in the problem space thinking about outcomes. I have not yet talked about a solution, and that's by design. But the next step is to start getting into researching, designing, testing, prototyping, coming up with solution ideas for how you might solve the problem. What this might look like in practice, you might do some prototyping with a design team. You might mock up, say, a sample user interface of an idea to test that problem. You might go out and test it with 15 users or so. In this fictional example, I've pretended that we did some upfront research that showed that Australia solved this problem with something called a Tell Us Once platform that could save users information and autofill forms for them. We were really interested in this, and so we mocked up a prototype and tested it with 50 of our frequent flyer users. And in our mock-up, it took them 98% less time to fill out a form, and that tripled their satisfaction score. Again, all fictional, but gives you an idea of the sort of thing you might want to the type of research you might want to do to validate your solution idea before even asking for money. So once you've done this kind of solutioning and designing and iterating, you're in a good place to understand and start framing out a good approach that's well suited to the problem space to solve this problem. So back to our fictional example, we know this problem space is pretty uncertain and risky. Only a single government we could find anywhere in the world has actually solved this problem. And so we think to deal with that risk and uncertainty, the best approach would be building a small agile team made up of both staff and contractors, set clear, measurable success measures for them to tackle, and then have them kind of incrementally chip away at those objectives and come up with ways of building a Tell Us Once platform that addresses that need. Again, this approach shows when we've met our objectives, we're going to cut down on the team size and decrease our investment a little bit, and that smaller team will keep maintaining and iteratively improving the product forever if we're successful. 6 is around estimating costs. So once you've got an approach, you can kind of scope out some best and worst case scenarios, and it's always good to be upfront about that and to acknowledge risk. So in this fictional example, based on our research and prototyping, we think it'll take us about 18 months or so to build a proper TELUS Once platform. Our biggest risk, and we're upfront about this is really important, trying to hide risk and uncertainty actually is more of a red flag, whereas being honest and transparent lands really well with our team and the DIO, our deputy board, or others. But in this example, our biggest risk might be attracting teams that run existing digital services to use our platform. So how do we tackle that risk? That's probably a big question. Cost estimating, the best cost estimates are those based on team burn. So what does your team cost every month? Multiply it out by roughly the number of months you think you'll need to have them going. So in this case, I've come up with 18 months at $100,000 a month means we need probably about $1.8 million in capital. Once we're live, our team will shrink by 3 people, and it'll cost us only $50,000 per month in ongoing operating expenses. But back to our amortization cost, we need to account for $30,000 per month in amortization costs. And so you can really easily build a nice financial model once you've done that legwork on getting a good approach. One anti-pattern I want to talk about is the dogmatic use of any one approach. And an example, platform as a service, agile, waterfall, custom development. Those are all valid methodologies, approaches for the right problem space. And so fitting the right approach to the right problem space is really important. If you want to read a little more about that, I really like the Wardley mapping framework, and so highly recommend people go dig into that to learn more. Okay, 8th step is develop and evaluating options, and I want to talk a little bit about this. This is something teams often leave out or forget about or don't do properly. Back to our fictional example, 3 good options might be one, let's do a TELUS Once platform. 2, maybe we think we could solve this problem using verifiable credentials. Or 3, maybe we don't do this and spend the money elsewhere on a higher priority thing. Those are 3 kind of good options. What a bad option might look like would be trying to push up an approach decision or a technical decision to a deputy minister's committee. So in this example, I've said option 1, custom build. Option 2, XYZ commercial off-the-shelf system. Option 3, ABC commercial off-the-shelf system. What do you think, Deputy Minister? Should we go with ABC or XYZ? That's sort of what it sounds like to them, right? They're not equipped to make those decisions. They are really equipped to make the decisions on those first options I ran through, but avoiding pushing technical decisions like this up to especially the most senior levels of government is really good. They prefer recommendations and options based on overall strategy. So following this approach, back to the iceberg analogy, takes a lot of upfront work, but will result in a pitch that is way more targeted than many of them out there. And it'll also be really easy to write. As I said, it'll almost write itself once you've done all that work. It'll also be far more likely to succeed. So I'm sure we'll tackle more about this in questions. So last thing I wanted to do is just talk through kind of the hacking the system, Jedi Master, the Yoda level. Back to some of my early bosses in the technology space. I learned these tricks from many of them and want to share a few of them with you. The first, do you have to make a funding request in the first place? Government spends $680 million a year on technology. That's a lot of money that's already in the system. There's a lot of money kind of floating there, locked in program areas already. So don't forget about the funding you already have, and don't overlook maybe stopping some things or shutting some things down in order to reprioritize money towards new priorities. Two, and I'll talk, the next two are actually quite linked, but flipping your thinking from projects to products and services, really, really important. And the masters do this really well. They don't think of, back to our fictional example, tell us once for the Yodas of this world is not a project. It's a product that will live on probably for 20 years and need continuous care and feeding and improvement in response to policy change, user needs, et cetera. So they might plan a little spike of a project to get it off the ground. Maybe in 3 years, they do another kind of spike of work to iterate on it or add a big feature. But they're very much thinking long-term, and they're thinking of it as products and services. Third, and this is where we're getting into the real art, blending different types of funding, capital and operating, maybe supplementing with some vendor credits. I want to show you a little bit about what that looks like. If I've got on screen sort of an investment curve of how, on the left, we've got how we historically have funded capital projects. Huge upfront blitz of capital funding for 5 years to do a big capital build. And then once we're live, we're starving it with just as little money as we can possibly get away with to maybe do the bare bones patching and security updates. But otherwise, it's sort of software that's just sitting there on a shelf aging. And those of us who have been around software long enough know that software ages a little bit like fish. It gets stinkier the older it gets. And so in contrast, you might want to think about kind of blended approaches where the baseline is kind of operating funding, a permanent team that's looking after a product. And maybe you're supplementing with little blitzes of capital to get really narrow, specific feature work done or that sort of thing. So I see the real masters are very much in this blended funding approach stage. The last, don't forget to tell a good story. We see this so many times. Presenting to a deputy board can be a little intimidating. Making these kinds of pitches can be really intimidating. The single best thing you can do is open with a story. How does this problem actually manifest on the ground? How can you make it real and bring it to life? And those really make for the most successful funding requests. So I'll stop there and take questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you, JP. I really appreciated the various levels of foundational knowledge and then getting into some of the tricks. We do have some questions coming in, and one is actually related to one of the tactics that a master would use. And just generally, why do we fund projects and not products? Funding projects often means that the funding ends, but so too then does that continuous improvement approach. So if apps aren't static, why are we taking an approach to fund projects?
Yeah, this has its roots in history, I think, and it goes all the way back to when a lot of the technology that underpinned big organizations like government were huge mainframe systems and complicated financial and enterprise resource planning systems that were required huge upfront investment, needed to be planned in detail upfront. You could not get any detail wrong, and so they were approached much the same way you would approach building a bridge. You bring in engineers, you plan it in great detail up front, and only when you've kind of chased down every last risk and have known everything that's possible to know, do you make the decision to go ahead and build it. And so the framework for technology spending kind of traces its roots all the way back to then. Fast forward to today, though, 2022, running a digital service used by millions of British Columbians is not the same thing as running a mainframe system. And while those methodologies might have worked for some of those use cases I talked about, good luck trying to plan, what's a good example? Maybe let's use the health gateway. Good luck trying to plan the health gateway years in advance, understand in great detail how it would be used, predict the COVID-19 pandemic and that people would need to go into it to download their vaccine credentials. You just can't really do it that way. And instead, I think we're shifting to systems like that being just a part of day-to-day service delivery in government, and they need to evolve as user needs evolve, technology evolves, et cetera. So this is a huge challenge. I spend a lot of my time, and my team spends a lot of our time thinking about how we address it, but that's a little bit of the why we fund things as projects today.
I think sometimes we're still working within these systems that have been created, like you said, eons ago, and yet technology moves so quickly, the approaches we take are shifting, so how do we help these kind of structures keep up? We have another question here about the amortization. Just generally, do those costs show up on operating budgets?
They do, yeah.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
And it varies across government. Some ministries have central pots of money where they, the chief financial officers track amortization costs and kind of take care of it. Whereas in other areas, it actually shows up in branch budgets. So you can imagine a branch that just delivered a $5 million project and gets hit with $1 million charge now against their small branch budget. That can be a huge sting.
Is that based on whether the ministry is front-facing service delivery or more internal, or is it varied?
Totally depends just on internal ministry policy.
Okay, fair enough. We have another question here about assessing the difference between user experience and user experience theater. So that is to say the practice of doing UX, but then not actually acting on the results. So how do you really kind of determine whether the right research has been done up front to address what the problem is?
We find it's not just in the user research space, it's everywhere that there's a lot of theater in some of these funding requests. And in terms of UX research, I think playing dumb is my favorite tactic to understanding that and asking questions that might sound a bit kind of thick or simple and basic to draw more out of them. And the more you draw out of them, the more clear it becomes whether or not they've done the homework and understand what they're talking about.
Like the 5 whys, like why?
Five
why?
whys,
Yeah,
classic.
totally.
Yeah, ask the kinds of questions a toddler would ask, and you'll draw a lot out of them.
Yeah.
and be able to kind of myth bust.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have a question about comparing projects and products from different ministries. So obviously you get a whole slew of requests from varying ministries, internally facing, service delivery, externally facing, but how do you know what provides the best bang for buck when it comes to approving funding? And are there any kind of tactics that you guys take when you're comparing the requests that are coming in?
Yeah, this is a great question, really challenging one. So when we started out, I'd say about 5 or 6 years ago in the Digital Investment Office, we were sort of tasked with helping compare apples to oranges from across government. How does a health project compare to a natural resource sector project compared to a social sector project? At the time, we built this really comprehensive value framework that dozens of people from across government put in a ton of work into, and it weighed different criteria against government priorities and spit out a score for a specific project. That framework, unfortunately, never got updated over time, and there was a big loss of institutional knowledge around it that happened, and it was quite a comprehensive algorithm that came up with these scores. And what happened was, at the same time that was happening, our Deputy Minister Committee started really questioning their role in prioritization of cross-government things, and instead came up with this approach where they'd rather leave it to ministries to prioritize within an envelope that they set, because in their minds, a ministry knows their legislation best, they know their mandate letter items best, they know what their priorities are better than anyone. And so let's come up with the overall envelope size, and that's how we now prioritize where money goes across government. But we let ministries prioritize projects within that. We're testing out this new approach for the first time this year. and we'll see how it goes. We'll evaluate it and see whether it works and whether it makes sense. But that's what we're doing. That also frees our team in the DIO up to focus a lot more on project quality and on digging into those 5 whys to kind of understand things like user research theater and really be able to assess kind of risks and also help teams get on a good path and craft a successful funding request. So.
Very cool. That's awesome. Actually, on that UX, we actually had another question that came in about, convincing decision makers the true value of this. Like when we engage the people that are affected, we really start to understand like what the problem is as opposed to assuming what the solution is. But have we encountered a lot of aversion to this in public sector work or the work that you're doing? And how are you guys kind of convincing those of the value of it?
Yeah, so 6 years ago, I went on my first ever user research trip to northern British Columbia to do user research. And I had to essentially lie about why I was going up in order to be allowed to go up and do that research. And so it was really uncomfortable to have public servants out talking to members of the public, especially people from Victoria, headquarters people going out in regions at the time and asking questions of people and interacting directly with British Columbians. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen such a huge change, and we've got, within citizen services and government digital experience, we've got this rock star service design team that's done a lot of good work to drive those expectations that, the default should be doing that user research. GDX has done great work in that space. The Exchange Lab's done great work in that space. And I think we've got enough case studies and examples that's now the new norm. And if you do run into trouble, you can always point to things like the digital principles, and which set a really clear expectation that the default expectation is doing user research and designing and building and continuously improving systems with users.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue actually to one of our other questions, where it's like user experience looks at like the experience a citizen has when they're interacting, but then that's just a piece of the actual service. So there's like looking at the service overall. So a question that came in was, I'm told that service designers can actually be quite useful to teams when trying to define their needs. Are there any recommendations that you can provide about this in terms of like when you might want to include someone focused on user experience versus service design and looking at things holistically?
Yeah, sure. So there's a huge spectrum in design, and I'm not a designer, but I read about it a ton, and my designer friends will know that I'm always pestering them with questions. But there's a whole spectrum starting way up front, looking at entire systems and systems design, strategic design. As you get more zoomed in on like a service and understanding it end to end and understanding what's happening in the front office and the back office and the supporting systems. Service designers are your best friend for those sorts of problems. Then as you dive into the user experience, interacting with a service, experience or interaction designers are your best friend there. As you get more zoomed in into how does a user actually interact with an interface and how do we make that work for them. User interface designers and usability testers are your friend. And through the pandemic, I got a chance to work with a usability designer for the first time, and it completely blew my mind just how data-driven and sophisticated that discipline is. So that was new to me. So whole spectrum, and depending on the sort of the level of scale you're looking at for the problem, you want to kind of tap designers with different skill sets.
Very cool. One of the things I'm kind of curious about as we shift away from we talked a little bit about legacy systems and we're trying to move towards, smaller modular kind of development. How does the growth of scalable cloud services start to impact funding requests that you're seeing?
We're in the really early days for this. What I will say is I think I would anecdotally say there's a correlation where projects coming forward for funding that are looking to use our private cloud platform feel to me, and this is again very anecdotal and I don't know if we have evidence for it, they feel to me as though they take probably 30 to 50% less time and cost 30 to 50% more. And so I think that speaks to a little bit just how much faster you can go with more modern hosting solutions. As we go on to public cloud, I think that will change even more. And yeah, through the pandemic, I know there were a lot of teams working on public cloud, and I think all of them would tell you they've never delivered software faster or for less money than on modern hosting platforms. So that's a little bit of what I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Are you seeing a lot more of those types of requests come through? Yeah, hey, very cool. We have a very interesting question here about like, how do people start to grow from, say, a Padawan into becoming a Jedi Master? So where would you recommend people start to begin this journey if they want to become a Jedi Master in this space?
Yeah, I would recommend trying to get involved with wherever you're working, whether it's trying to get a couple of licenses for some sort of kind of workflow tool or something like that for your branch and trying to talk your boss into that. Start there, start anywhere, wherever you are, and you'll see kind of using these principles applies to anything from a $50 a month license request all the way up to a $5 million capital project and anything in between. I think these principles apply. The best thing you can do though is in your area, if you know of anyone who's kind of working on a funding request for something, if you can get involved in a Treasury Board submission, even if it's not for technology, if there's a capital technology initiative happening in your area, if you can get involved in that funding request and get on the team, just put up your hand and volunteer. The best way to get into it is to do it. The other thing is, the front end of the presentation might have seemed boring, but you kind of have to be fascinated with what appears initially to be boring initially to kind of truly become Yoda. So it's only by understanding the system within which you operate that you'll get to that level. And so do the boring things. Read the budget, which I find fascinating every year. Go read the budget estimates. Go read the legislature website about how funding decisions get made in government. Go look at Treasury Board staff's intranet site and understand how that works.
Yeah, those are great tips. Actually, on the things that get funded, what would you say in your experience has been a common reason for things to not get funded or be denied?
A couple of common themes. I think the biggest, I would say, is funding requests that are kind of too broad and not specific enough, and where we just can't get a good understanding of what government is actually buying with their money. I think it's as simple as that. Typically, the bigger the ask, the vaguer it is. That's not always true, but can be true. But that's, I think, fundamentally the single biggest thing. If you can't articulate on a Post-it note what government is buying and what benefits we're going to get out of a funding request, that's the most typical reason why you might have challenges getting through the funding process. So other areas though that we dig into quite a bit, things like if you're getting too reliant on a vendor, or your architectures, maybe you're getting into kind of a black box commercial off the shelf. Kind of, not to say those commercial off the shelf is bad, and in fact it's potentially a great option depending on your problem space. But when you're getting into kind of black box, really complex boutique commercial off the shelf stuff that maybe depends on a single vendor, isn't widely used, those start raising alarm bells. So, but the single biggest one is your asks aren't specific enough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And coming back to some of the things we said earlier, maybe the research isn't there, there's not enough data. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I think we have time for about one, maybe two more questions. And it kind of you touched a little bit on it, but how are you defining success? Like, we know that government spends a lot of money every year on IT, but how do we know what impacts it's having, and how are you guys measuring that?
This is a really tough question, and one my team's been spending a lot of time thinking about. This year, so I think it's fairly easy when we zoom in on a project level and we've now got most of our projects have defined clear outcomes and are tracking success measures, and that's awesome. The challenge for us becomes, how do you kind of roll that up to across $110 million a year of projects? That's over $1 billion over 10 years. That's a lot of money. How do you understand the aggregate impact of that? So we're really wrestling with that question. To make a start this year, we've created four objectives for our capital envelope. The first is overarching one. We want to invest in programs and services that make things better for British Columbians. Within that, we've got three categories of service or of objectives. One is investing in things that are ministry priorities, so legislative priorities, mandate letter commitments, that sort of thing. Second is investing in priority legacy systems that are critical and could potentially radically impact service delivery, and we've got a few measures we're tracking at an envelope scale around that. And then the third is around reducing duplication and common components, and so we've got a third category there with a few measures there. But if anyone's got ideas, our team in the DIO would love to chat.
That's really cool. Yeah. I'm sure like a lot of folks kind of want to see the impacts of what they're doing and making sure that the money is going to good technology, especially all of us as taxpayers. I think we have time for one more question. The last one that came in is, how can you do the prototyping work to prepare for the funding request before you have the budget? Like, so how do you even start thinking about this? And do you have any tips that you can share? Yeah,
this is often a big challenge. What I would say is prototyping doesn't have to be, a $500,000 consulting engagement with a high-end firm. It could be as simple as two people in your branch mocking up something on paper or on Miro or on a whiteboard and having a conversation with British Columbians about it. User research is quite cheap to do. It takes time and effort, but there are great resources available. If you want to check out the Service Design Playbook that GDX puts out, it's a phenomenal resource to give you all kinds of tools and approaches to do this work. So it doesn't have to be big. It can be really simple, and you can start tomorrow with some of these things. But I do appreciate some of these bigger funding requests do require a lot of upfront work, and I think that's where you need, back to those funding curves, having that funding up front for a small team to design some of these funding requests and think about these problems and build a good funding request is really important. So
I'm probably thinking more like a product as opposed to like a short project, right?
Yeah.
What's the roadmap of this product going to look like, and what might we anticipate in the future? So. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your insights on this. This has been fantastic. I know we still have a couple of questions we didn't get to. I'm sure folks can follow up with you afterwards if they have any further questions. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. We'll post the video link up so you can watch it again if you have any other questions or thoughts after the fact. And please fill out our survey. We'll be sending one out after the session ends so that you can give us some feedback. We did get a couple comments about future sessions, so we'd love to hear more about what you'd like to see and any topics you'd be interested in learning more about. So thanks again, and thanks to our crew and to JP for joining us. Have a good day.